it feels all over the place just because, oh, and just to let you know, we are recording. So my plan for this conversation.
I'm sorry about that. I did not check with you ahead of time. Is that okay with you, or would you prefer not to record?
Oh, it's fine.
There's some people who are going to miss the session because of a conflict with another meeting, and so if that's all right with you, I'll make it available just to other students.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
So when I originally was preparing for the talk, I had a plan, and then the world exploded and plans kind of shifted. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the hashtag STEM shutdown components. Going to talk about bias within STEM and relate it back to the material that you all had an opportunity to engage with, whether it was the video or the actual articles that you read. And then I'm going to share a little bit more content around bias in STEM and what is implicit versus explicit bias, or really what is implicit bias and how does that exist within STEM and what can you do. So I tried to make it flow. It's not going to, so it's going to feel choppy, and I apologize in advance for that. So I realized with my previous talk that when I share my screen, sometimes my audio goes out. So Stan, if you can be the one to let me know if you can hear me or not, that would be very helpful. Okay, can you hear me? No. Okay. Yes? No. Let me see. What do I need to do? Okay, can you hear me now?
Hey, Janelle, it was okay the whole time, actually.
Oh, okay.
We were responding on video. We should have opened our mics.
It's okay. All right. So here we go. Let's see how this turns out. So what is bias? When we think about bias, we are looking at implicit and unconscious bias primarily today, and it's basically attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. So I'm going to play a video that's going to explain this a little bit more and give you some examples. And then after that video, I'm going to break you up into the breakout rooms so you can talk individually about what does bias look like for you. So within STEM. So I've got some folks who are coming in on, are entering in late. So hold on one second.
Yeah, I've been able to admit them as that has popped up, so I'll keep doing that.
New research from the fields of neuroscience and social psychology has shed light onto the concept of unconscious bias. But what exactly is unconscious bias, and how does it affect our behaviors and decisions? Unconscious biases are simply our unintended people preferences. They are formed by our socialization, our personal experiences, and the representations of different groups in the media. These experiences act as social filters in which we make assessments and judgments of people around us. Research tells us that human beings have a natural tendency to place individuals into social categories. These categories are often based on visual cues such as gender, cultural background, age, height, or body size. We also categorize based on social background, job roles, religious identity, or political affiliation. The unconscious brain uses associations based on social categories to develop biases. For example, if we are constantly exposed to women as primary school teachers or receptionists, or men as plumbers and organizational leaders, these associations become wired within the human brain. The unconscious brain uses social categories to make unconscious judgments about people who are similar to us and people who are different from us. A common form of unconscious bias is affinity bias. This type of bias impacts talent processes in organizational decision-making, including how we recruit. Managers are more likely to hire people who look similar or with sounding names to them. Work allocation. Managers are more likely to assign key client projects to individuals within their teams who they have an unconscious affinity with. Performance. Where there is some kind of affinity, managers are more likely to spend time informally discussing positive contributions to the team and will focus on development and future work plans. For those where there is little affinity, managers are more likely to question past performance. The conversation will be less friendly and even hostile at times. Unconscious bias often results in a set of micro-behaviors. Examples of positive micro-behaviors include supporting the ideas of someone with who you have an unconscious affinity whilst in a team meeting, or simply wanting to have coffee with someone like you. Examples of negative micro-behaviors include checking emails on your phone whilst talking to a colleague or cutting someone off in a meeting. Often our intention is not to make biased decisions, and through a focus on conscious thinking and by creating inclusive work cultures, we can learn to control our unconscious judgments and mitigate the impact of bias on our talent programs. For more information on the nature of unconscious bias and how to mitigate its effects, contact ENEI, www.enei.org.uk, info@enei.org.uk, telephone 0207.
And Janelle, maybe now your audio is gone. We can hear the video, but we can't hear you speaking.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So you can call them if you want. I can give you their number. But when we think about how biases are formed, there are so many different opportunities for our thought processes to be influenced. And so we're thinking about from childbirth on. Elementary, you're getting coded messages. You're getting messages, period. They don't necessarily have to be coded. Middle school, high school, throughout all of our education practices, your neighborhoods, your TV shows, your families, your places of worship, et cetera, and the list goes on. There are pieces around what we understand of people, our environments, and how they interact and how we should interact with them based on the environments that we're in. So sometimes we experience like a nature versus nurture concept of where does this actually come from? We all have biases. We all operate with a level of stereotype to understand and fix what we think or where the gaps should be filled in around different people, identities, and cultures, especially when we do not have exposure to them. So when I was looking at your responses, thank you to those of you who filled out the Google form, there was a theme of, yes, there is bias within STEM, and then it shifted. So there's bias. I've never experienced it. I've never seen it, but I know it's there because there are so few marginalized folks within the STEM field. And then there were responses of, there's bias and I've seen it and this is how it has affected me. So there's a general consensus that yes, it exists, but how do we deal with it? How do we make change? How do we address it is really what the overall question within the comments that I read and the themes within the comments. And so I'm gonna actually ask you all to do some of that work, because I think when you're sitting in spaces where you have the opportunity to engage with one another, I'm gonna hope that you all will all contribute to the conversation. I'm asking that faculty are in that space, not to drive the conversation, but to help to facilitate it and make sure that people are actually talking. And these are spaces where I have no clue. It is a random shifting of who's in that space. So please take time to briefly introduce yourself and what project you're working on this summer. And then we're gonna do this for about 10 to 12 minutes. So I want you to sit with this group and really talk about how are biases formed within STEM? what does this look like? How have you seen it? How have you not seen it? When we have these conversations, it's really, really important for you all to make sure that you're not invalidating someone's experience and how someone has experienced their classroom or their curriculum or their group projects, their lab work, etc. Because when we come from these spaces and we think about where have I experienced bias, or what have I seen, or what have I experienced, we're asking that people are being vulnerable and that they're sharing something in a confidential space. And so please be aware of that. Take time to listen to one another as well, because you might have an opportunity to learn something about another person that you didn't know before. And for our faculty, please feel free to send me any questions that you have in the personal chat. Just make sure that it says Janelle, not everyone, if you've got any questions on how the breakout will go. So it's going to take me a minute to get everything set up. So one moment. Okay. So we're going to break out into 8 rooms. So there's going to be 4 folks in a room, and I'm just going to make sure that I've got faculty in each space. Okay, so for the most part, actually, I'm gonna delete a room because we have more faculty on here than I thought, which is awesome. But I need to spread you guys out a little bit more. Okay. For those who are watching this on the recording, I'm sorry. Okay, so I'm going to open all the rooms. I might shift a little bit more, but if I do any shifting, it will be faculty moving space to space, okay? So you will receive an invite, and you should have received it now.
Hi, Kirsten.
Hello, it's Kirsten.
Kirsten, sorry.
It's all right, I'm used to it.
William, Crystal, how are you guys doing?
Hi, Professor. How are you?
Good.
Hi, I'm good.
I'm Professor Zygmunt. I've met some of you before. And so, what did you think about the explanation of bias that Janelle gave?
I mean, honestly, for me, it was the same video as last year, so it's not really much anything new for me.
Have you experienced, and again, like she said, we're kind of asking people to be vulnerable. It could be something dealing with you or with somebody else, but have you experienced either conscious or unconscious bias in classes or labs?
I think for me, I've experienced some sorts of biases. It comes more towards like people's reaction when I tell them what my major is, and that's just within like my peers and even within like my family and whoever I interact with. So when they ask me what's your major, I tell them electrical engineering, and the shock on their face, like, what? How? Why? you know, that kind of reaction. And I think because they might not picture me being that, they might picture me doing something else. So I think that's how I've experienced it, at least like more frequently compared to like the other smaller biases that might be out there. But yeah, so I don't think people expect like a woman or, you know, I'm a person of color being an engineer, so that might be a form of shock to them.
Sure. Yeah. I'll bet you have a collection of interesting responses that you've gotten.
Oh yeah, a lot of them is mostly like, why are you doing so much work for that, or do you really like math, like those type of reactions. But you know, it's, some of them have been mostly positive. A lot of them like, they're a lot of like proudness and a lot of like, you're doing great type of responses, which is good.
Yeah, it's funny. There's like a difference between somebody being surprised and somebody, you know, being surprised and then, you know, saying something else that really puts you down. Did you see the question that Janelle flashed at the top of the screen there for a minute? She asked, yeah, okay. She asked how, I'm sorry, I should have let you guys all, do you guys all know each other? My fault.
No.
All right, so go ahead. If you want to put your, you know, video on, feel free, but that's up to you. But go ahead, introduce yourselves. I'm sorry.
I'm William. I'm a physics major. I'm working with Professor Gibson on the STAR experiment.
Well, my name is Crystal. Since you guys already know, I'm electrical engineering. I'm working with Professor Pete Johnson in the mechanical department. And I am technically a 5th year, so I guess you consider it as like a senior year. So yeah.
Hi, I'm Kirsten. Sorry that there's a huge echo in here. And I'm a biology major, and I'm doing research with Professor Waters on Neurospora, which is a fungus. And I was actually going to continue on with what Crystal was talking about, and with that conversation is that they are like, on one hand, it is really nice when people, when they act surprised, it's not fun, but when they like act proud of you. But then there also gets to the point where if they're too proud, it almost becomes patronizing. For like, as somebody with autism, a lot of the times I see people like make a big deal about somebody with autism or another disability, like, oh my goodness, they were able to do this, when it's just like they're just living their lives.
Yeah, the next question that she put up there, although it came earlier, was how are biases formed in STEM fields? So that's kind of an open-ended question. I got to shut my window here because there's some road construction going on outside my window. So any thoughts on that? Is there anything special about STEM disciplines that, you know, make it more likely that people are going to accumulate biases?
Well, I know for at least us, Professor, in physics, since physics has always been like much more of a man's work, I guess, historically, like a lot more men have gone into it, especially like white men. It's kind of just having that historical basis for that, like not having a lot of women or minorities, and it just kind of puts biases on them already that we're not, that some people aren't familiar with seeing in the field. So it kind of stems from that, at least in our field. I don't know about others.
Or also just outside of, like, a lot of the biases you see within STEM are biases you see in every area, but also with STEM, because it's so academic heavy, every single layer of bias that somebody's academics further affects their level of ability to be in a career within the STEM field. So if because of bias in the academic acceptance in the schools, it causes issues, and then bias and stuff with how school funding works affects people's education, and it just all stacks up. So by the time you get to somebody who's trying to get a doctorate, that's like way more layers that they have to break through in order to make it that far.
Yeah, it's kind of maybe even more than just additive. It might be a multiplicative effect, all of those different layers. Yeah, I was thinking as Janelle was talking that, one of the things that we who are in science and engineering get really good at after a while is pattern recognition. And the idea that you see on an exam, you see a problem you're supposed to solve, and you say, oh, hey, I've seen that one before, or something like that before, and that helps you solve it. So we recognize patterns, and I think, like William said, when you have a fewer number of, let's say, women in physics, right, then you just kind of get used to that as a pattern. And you start thinking, oh, I guess just that's the way it is, right? When, probably the smarter thing to do is, notice the pattern, but then you scratch your head and question it, and don't just accept that that's the way it's supposed to be, but, why is that? What's going on there?
I think in my experience, oh, sorry.
No, you're okay. You go. You haven't
Okay.
talked in a while, and I have.
In my experience, I think I've been pretty lucky to have, like throughout my childhood, through elementary school, middle school, high school, I was taught mostly by women mathematicians and like women physics teachers. And I think for me, it was kind of like the reverse thing where because I was taught by so many women, I thought that, a lot of people did that and a lot of women were in those fields. I think in total, before going to college, I was taught by like 2 male math teachers throughout my whole, educational career. So when I came to Valpo, it completely flipped. I saw a lot more more male professors. And that's where I thought it was more diverse than that. So it was kind of like of a reverse, maybe, I guess, reverse bias for me, like thinking like this was the common thing, but it changed when I reached the college. So, yeah, I thought that was a little different when I came here for sure.
Yeah, it was interesting. I don't know if any of you read one of those 2 articles that I shared the links to. The one of them that I read had to do with the way that faculty members evaluate applications for a graduate student who was applying for a postdoctoral position in their department. And what they did, which was kind of a clever thing, was they took an identical application, an identical CV, and they just put different names on it, where the names then made it clear whether the person was male or female and whether it was a particular ethnic group. And so they had, hundreds and hundreds of faculty evaluate these things. And what was interesting to me was that the strongest bias in the way that the faculty reported the relative strengths of the candidates was in a physics departments. And the least amount of bias, at least for male and female. Now there was different ethnic group biases that were hard to figure out exactly, but the male-female part was much less significant in the biology departments. And so it kind of, it was sort of a hopeful sign that in biology departments where in the sample, I think they said 60% of the biology faculty were male, 40% were female, whereas in physics it was something like 85 and 15. So it gave a little bit of hope that exposure, when faculty members are exposed to an environment where men and women are both represented more equally, then they're less likely to have bias than in other fields where the male-female balance is way out of whack.
Does anyone want to volunteer to share, since we were just asked if one of us would share?
I mean, I don't know if this would count as, I guess it does. I mean, I'm not going to name names, but some of the professors in the physics department can act a bit condescending towards all of the students, especially some of the female students in it. And I'm sure that comes down to just the biases that they've developed over time. I've experienced it less than some of the female students in our department, but it still has happened, and it's kind of noticeable if you pay attention to it.
Yeah, thanks, William. I mean, it doesn't feel great to hear that, but the truth is, what do they say about the best disinfectant is sunlight? So these things have to be exposed.
Yeah, no, I didn't mean to say it out of rudeness or being condescending. It's just something that needs to be pointed out.
No need to apologize. No. Hey, Kirsten, were you asking whether somebody would be willing to speak to the group on behalf of our group? Is that what it was?
Yeah, because that's what the announcement thing.
Okay, yeah, I missed it when it came up. Yeah, so hopefully one of you guys can do that. Who would like to do it?
I don't mind doing so if neither of the others want to, so.
Wait, since you're the only face I can see, that sounds great. Thanks. All right, looks like it's time to leave so we can go back to the main session. Thanks, you guys. We might see each other again. I don't know if she's going to do another breakout or not.
Yeah, I have no idea.
80s? Looks very 80s.
Oh, it is definitely the 80s. The skinny ties give it away.
I'm digging the dreads.
He's like he's an alien.
This is not what I was expecting to come back to.
I never saw it. Invasion of the Body Snatchers? Or is that 60s?
There's originally a 60s version, and they made a remake in the 80s.
I'm just pleased that I got The Shining correct. So I'll take that for my one win today. So thank you all. If you haven't experienced the breakout rooms, I think that's a really cool component of Zoom. So for those of you who are going to be facilitating via Zoom, it's a really awesome way. Hopefully you notice I popped in and out. That was my way of walking around the classroom if we were doing this in person. So it seemed a little bit more normal of a presentation style for me. I want to go ahead and open up the floor for our spokesperson from each room. So hopefully you had a chance to pick someone brave enough to come into the space and kind of share, what did you talk about in your room? What was one thing that you all discussed from your breakout session that you think is worth sharing to the larger group?
Or are we going by number?
Were you all able to see what the room number you were in?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's do that. So let's go with room 1.
Okay, I think I'm room number 1. Stop me if I'm not. But we talked about, I think the big thing about this whole presentation is that a lot of times these biases are unconscious. So one thing that we discussed would be a good idea, I guess, is to not only make a conscious effort to recognize these biases, but also kind of go above and beyond that a little bit by intentionally doing good deeds every day and things along those lines, just, you know, making people's days a little bit brighter.
Awesome. Be intentional about the work that you're doing and the way that you're communicating and interacting with others. Like that. Room 2.
So we mostly just talked about how like biases, how we like tend to like perceive them on ourselves as well, and that can just come from like a lack of representation like within like the STEM community. Valpo does a pretty good job of like being inclusive and not really forming these types of biases with the students, but definitely like a lack of representation within like the STEM field itself like allows this to like happen.
Awesome. Great. Room 3.
I didn't actually notice what group I was in by number. Were we in 3? Okay. What we decided as a group was that scientists are really no better or worse than everybody else. And so we get all of our biases from the same places as everybody else. After all, you know, we got most of those biases before we were scientists, so we're just folks. The VU environment, we thought maybe was a little more prone to perpetuating some biases because it was more homogeneous than some other collegiate environments might be. Was there anything else that you want to add? Okay, that was it.
Awesome. Room 4.
I also don't know what number I was, so I'll just pretend I was 4. I could have sworn it was a letter. We talked about a few different things. I think one of the more important things we talked about was how, like, yeah, we have the same biases as other groups, but because of the high academic level it's at, those biases really build up. So like somebody who was from a poor community or an ethnic community might have had lower quality public school because of the way the funding works for that. And then there was the bias for them to be able to get into undergrad and the bias they had to get through to get into graduate school, and all these different things all building up. It's going like, it's like multiple layers of different filter papers that are being put on them.
Thank you. Room 5.
We didn't exactly decide on a spokesperson, so if anybody else wants to speak up, go ahead and interrupt me from group 5. We didn't make it for the countdown. But we talked about how a lot of biases probably most biases are formed really early, from things like what toys you're given as a kid to the access that you have to different types of education when you're really young. And we talked about how as you move on in education, a lot of the in-groups, like the people who have the power, are sort of self-perpetuating, where if those people go on to graduate school and become professors, then they want to hire students and people who look like them, and so it's a bit of a self-perpetuating cycle there. Mm-hmm. We were just starting to talk about specific actions of how to make things better, and we ran out of time. But
awesome. We'll get to actions. Great. I think I closed room 6, so let's go room 7.
Hey, yeah, we were in group 7, and I think the main thing we tried to talk about was when each of us noticed like a switch in like diversity or something, or like from our backgrounds of where we came from, and then going to undergrad or something like that. And so for my experience was like a fairly diverse high school and like upbringing in like a smaller town. And then coming to Valpo was a little bit less diverse, especially in like my chemistry classes and things like that. Mm-hmm. And so like that's when I noticed a change. And then I know for some of the other people in our group, there wasn't a huge change because it was always like a certain amount of diversity, and it kept up through that all the way through undergrad. And so it's been similar. So. Yeah,
I hear that a lot when students come to Valpo. This is either the most diverse place they've ever been or the least. Like there's really no middle ground. So awesome. And last room, room 8.
Hi. In our room, we discussed, like the other group, how biases can start at a young age. More specifically, how certain fields can see less diversity because people from certain groups from a young age are kind of pulled away from STEM because it's either believed that it's not their place to be there, or family members or their community thinks that they can't handle it. I discussed my own experience with I'm autistic and how some people tried to get me away from STEM because they thought I couldn't handle it. And it's just, and how that can affect how the, I'm sorry, yeah, how it can affect the diversity in those specific careers too, because certain people from a young age are excluded.
Yeah. And I think when, and thank you for sharing your own personal example. I think when we think of when do we start to see the shift, when we're saying, okay, you should, and I don't think it's a secret that there's a push for STEM right now in our education. Like STEM is where people need to go. But when I was growing up, I'm in my 30s. When I was growing up, STEM was not a push for girls, for little young girls. It was not a thing. There were certain fields where they said, you know, go this way, go that way. Boys do this, girls do that. And so even thinking about just like the heteronormative nature of career decision, there's a lot of pieces in there where many identities are often excluded from certain branches or persuade to go in other places as well. And so when we're looking at how do you prevent implicit bias from interfering with STEM, what are some of the ways that you all as future scientists, as engineers, as fill in the blank of all of the things that you all are studying and doing research on, how can you work to eliminate bias? If it's something that we all have, if we're all operating with layers and layers of existence and things that we're filtering daily, what is it that you could possibly do within your sphere of influence to shift your realm, your focus, your research, the people that you're helping, the people that are going to benefit from the work that you're doing and putting out into the world even today? And I have a list, but I want to hear some of your thoughts.
Well, I think instructors especially need to specifically ask for the viewpoints of a wider diversity of students. You know, there's always going to be some people who volunteer a lot and are happy to speak out, and others who are a little more reticent. And but you have to just realize that and specifically ask for people to participate.
Mm-hmm.
So I think another thing that we could also do was also making like information more accessible, more widespread, so that way more people from different areas and different backgrounds have access to it. Yeah.
I saw Professor Leisman.
Yeah, I was thinking that one of the things that instructors and students that we can do is like, I guess, believing in people, right? Like, you know, letting people know that they are in the right place, that, you know, they can succeed in you know, whatever field. Like STEM has a reputation of being difficult, right? And it's like, oh, it's, you know, just for certain people, you could never do it or whatever, right? To sort of fight against any of those attitudes and our ideas of, oh, you're going to be successful and you're not in this class or something like that. And really helping people know that, yeah, how much we believe in them and how excited we are for them.
Yeah. And one of the, in one of the pieces that was shared with through the Google form, there have been times when people have been told, like, no, I don't think you're going to make it. Like, this probably isn't the best field for you. And it's the first semester of college. Like, probably not the best and most motivating opportunity for a student to actually believe in themselves and believe in their capabilities and what they can contribute and everything that they've got going for them. So how do we change that language? How do we shift opportunities and thinking around access, not only to materials, but even just access to entry to the field, I think is really important. Professor Goyne?
Yeah, I think it's really important to make sure that there's enough need-based financial support, because I think that a lot of the disparities we see have an economic component, and I think that, you know, I don't personally have the money to endow something, but I think that should be a real high priority for the university community to make sure that you know, that financial barriers are not just crushing people. And I think in STEM, really, there are students who are just getting crushed financially. They're trying to work so many hours that they you know, they can't get enough sleep at night, and then they get sick, and it's just horrible.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think one of the things that's really interesting about COVID and the environment that we're now entering in as we come into the semester is, how do we, Crystal, I see you. I'll get to you in one sec. How do we exist in an environment where we're providing technology? We've noticed that some students are going back to environments where there's a shared house computer. In some cases, we might have students coming back to campus and their laptop was the laptop that their parents were using to work at home with. And so that laptop might stay at home, and then they come to campus and they need to use the computer labs. Well, we have to social distance. So do we still have the amount of access to technology? Do we need to think about how we're reworking our spaces, our community spaces in the library and Gellerson and all of these different buildings to make sure that students still have the same amount of access to tech and accessibility needs when they return to campus, because our environment and our culture is going to drastically shift. And so as you're thinking about bias in that term, in that sense, I would say it's really important to not assume a level of access of your peers as well as of your students. Crystal, you had your hand raised.
Adding on to everything else, I think through a student's perspective, having access to resources out there.
Crystal, we can't really hear you.
Oh, no. Can you hear me?
A little bit better.
Okay. So I was saying just having access to resources. Valpo gives plenty of resources when it comes to like job searching, but I feel like as a student coming in, being introduced to a lot of like the minority societies in STEM that are out there, or women's societies in whichever STEM career that you follow. I think being told that, you know, there's a group out there that's similar to you would help a lot for students. For example, and I don't mean to plug in my organization, but I started an organization 2 years ago in the College of Engineering called the Society of Hispanic Professional Engineers. And I think ever since we started that, we opened basically a door for a lot of the Hispanic students in engineering, to which we are open to all STEM students. We're not exclusive to engineering. So for the faculty out there, if you guys know of anybody, please guide them towards us, because that's our whole purpose, is to help Hispanic students in STEM. But I think ever since we've been open to that. We've been to the conferences and we've been contacted and networked with so many people who are similar to us. And I think that was a great resource that I wish I had my freshman year. And I had a similar story to what Janelle was saying. Like, I was told my first semester, like, are you sure you should do this? Not by a faculty member, but by family members. And it's very discouraging. And, you know, had I had that type of support back then, I think I would have felt more comfortable where I was at. So I think being exposed to those type of societies or those type of clubs would help a lot in the student's perspective. And I guess like a solution that I was already thinking about was, and I talked to my advisor from my group, was creating also some sort of scholarship, because I agree financials is a very big obstacle course that every student has to go through. But if you come through very difficult paths or very like difficult financial hardships, you know, it does become an obstacle, and it became an obstacle for me at some point. So I think having a particular scholarship or some sort of fund would help to, specific to STEM, because I know the OMP can only go so far. You know, we got to also branch out on our own too.
Yeah, and I think, thank you for sharing your experience, Crystal. And one thing that's really important too is when we think about socioeconomic disparities, it's not just within marginalized communities. It's not just within Black and Latinx and LGBT communities. Like, it is across the board. It doesn't mean that just because you have a person with a marginalized identity in your classroom that they cannot financially afford to be here, or they're going to have financial inequities within their family or within their home environment, et cetera. And so I think that was some of the common themes that I noticed within the forum as well, is that this particular group of people is the only group of people that experiences this. And so I want to make sure that we dispel that and understand that just because you're a white person at Valpo doesn't mean that you're rich, or that you have a middle class family, or that you have the financial aid necessary to be here. Maybe your family also has 4 other kids in college. Like, everyone's situation is drastically different. And some of the issues around bias is that we start to think that this particular group is the only group, or this particular group experiences one thing because of this particular identity or because of where they come from. And so I just want to make sure that point is clear. Please also pay attention to the group chat, because there are some comments coming in that I think are beneficial for everyone to know about, such as the EPIC program, and thinking about how about different funding and financial barriers there. So please make sure to check that out. I do want to share my screen because this hour has gone by really quickly, which is great, but I want to make sure that, can you still hear me? Okay, great. So things that you all can do. So this is tailored to staff and our students and faculty. So examine your curriculum. Who is being represented? So who are you putting at the forefront of your text and your materials? What researchers are you highlighting? Who is left out of the conversation? For students, recognize this on your own. Do your own research. Figure out what astronomer do you know of that is not being engaged in the conversation, and bring that person into your research. Cite that person in your work. Think about who is being shown in your videos. If you're showing clips of people speaking, and especially if they are representing your field, make sure that you have a diverse pool of people being represented in that material. Be intentional when hiring to fill your gaps, and then picking group members or lab partners. So as the video stated, we automatically go toward people who look like us, who share similar interests, similar characteristics, people that we immediately connect in with. But if you are working to be intentional with diversifying that group or diversifying the people that you're working with, you're going to have a better outcome and opportunity to eliminate bias, but then also have a variety of perspectives. If everyone in your group thinks the same way, you're probably missing out on some really key components that would be really necessary to supporting marginalized identities or any other identity besides your own in the work that you're doing. develop strong mentoring programs between faculty and students, and specifically between female faculty and female students. When we think about representation, it really, really matters. Some of the things that were mentioned were, if things are unintentional, how do we shift the culture? This is one of those things. If we don't see ourselves in different spaces, it's hard to recognize or think that that's a place where we belong, or it's something that we can accomplish and do. And so if we are really intentional with building mentoring relationships, whether it's through faculty and students or bringing in community partners who, if you don't have a representation across your faculty, bring in folks from the region who can reach out and help to support our students. But then also making sure that they have the opportunities, whether it's through SHIP or through NSBE or through SWE, right? Okay, yes, whether through SWE, to be able to get those relationships that they could really benefit from. Next, program, develop, create, build to the margins. If you're thinking about the person who is going to be left out of this plan, and you build towards them, you're going to be able to encompass everybody else too. So once you identify who's missing, who is impacted by this. If I were to build this bridge or I were to build this highway, who's potentially being displaced? And does that group of people all look the same? Do they all have the same socioeconomic status? Where are they going to go? You're not just building the bridge. You're not just building a highway, you're impacting people's lives. And so who are those folks who are impacted, and what are ways that you can work to be a little bit more cognizant of the folks who are involved in the work that you're going to be putting out into the world, if that makes sense. And then, because I'm at 115, the last one, what is the barrier? Figure out what you can do within your power to remove the barrier. So if you know that the environment that we're already in within the Valparaiso community is not one that is extremely diverse when it comes to race and ethnicity, then what are some of those things that you as a person, as a student, or as a faculty or staff member can be doing to say, I recognize that this is a thing. How do I shift that? Do I go back to my high school when I'm on break and talk to students about engineering at Valpo and what are all the great things that I'm doing? Or is there a mentoring program or something that I can help set up that's going to be a gateway for my high school to Valpo and this community? Are there opportunities to talk to high school students on our campus? Yes, there are. I have one. So if you're interested in doing that, how can you get in spaces where you're continuing to shift the culture and shift the change? Because it's not something that's going to happen overnight. It's something that has to be a long-term goal. So with that, I'm sorry we didn't get to shut down STEM. I hope that you took some time to engage in that hashtag. If you haven't already, just click on it. Go to Twitter, put it in Google, whatever social media opportunities that you have. Go through it and see what people are saying and see the voices, see the articles. It might help you in your current research today. Thank you all, and I'll stay on if people have questions, or if you need to go, please feel free, but I'll keep the line open if you have any questions or want to talk about anything or need resources. So thank you.
Thank you for the presentation.
Let's all thank Janelle, yes. And we do have, we want to make time for some questions for those who can stick around. So you can raise your hand or just unmute yourself and speak out.
Yeah.
Sorry, I wasn't sure if that was me or someone else you were saying yeah to.
Oh, it was not. It was someone else. But since you're talking, let's go.
Yeah, I guess one question I was thinking about is like, where do you draw the line between everybody wanting to be able to, interact, people trying to interact with minorities and people of different groups to, break down their bias and get used to talk and accept other people, and when it gets to the point where for the minority members of those minority groups that are being approached, it being too much people going to talk to them just for like that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think oftentimes folks with marginalized identities are asked to speak on behalf of a community or culture and identity, and that is a lot of work. I am currently as a Black woman, I was very anxious coming into this presentation because I'm like, there are so many things I could talk about. I don't know which direction to go. An hour is a short period of time, and I don't know. And then I had to pause and say, okay, well, the request wasn't, hey, Janelle, can you come talk to us and tell us about why police brutality is a negative impact on the Black community? I'm like, oh, okay, wait, I have to reframe and recognize like this is not what the request was. While I could talk about those things, it wasn't on educating others and educating a mass group of people around inequities to my community. This doesn't actually answer your question, I recognize that. But what I would say is that it is really, really important for folks with marginalized identities to recognize that they have, I would say, two responsibilities. One of those responsibilities is not only taking care of self and community, but also figuring out when and how to help to educate and advocate on behalf of your community. So you're never going to experience a time where people aren't, once they figure out an identity that you hold, people aren't going to ask you questions about it. Like they're always going to ask you. And so you have to figure out what's the best way for me as a person to say, well, here are some resources. Here's my experience. Here's a little bit of it. Here's some resources for you to continue to educate yourself. Feel free to bring that back to me if you want to discuss it and engage with it. But right now, it's not really the time that I feel is appropriate for us to talk about this, or I think that this might better explain situations or environments, or here are great authors, or here's great text and videos and things like that. So I think that there's a responsibility to say, here are some other resources. I'm not your only resource, and you as a person can go and educate yourself without saying like, hey, did you know there's Google? Because that's not beneficial either. So when we immediately say, oh, did you know that you could look this up on Google, or go to the library, that doesn't really help engage the conversation either. Does that help?
Yeah, I think so. I was sort of asking it from the other point of view, but both points of view are equally part of this.
Okay.
In a way.
If you want me to, if you're looking for a different type of answer, let me know.
Sorry, my brain's losing talking ability, so.
No worries. I had to turn my fan on. It's very hot in here. So let's see. There was another person who had unmuted. My screen is shifting.
Bruce, did you have a question or want to say something? I thought you were trying.
Okay. So this is not something I think about intentionally very much, but as you were going through the affinity bias, I guess the question came to my mind, is the word bias itself a negative, have a negative connotation? Because in an extreme case, it would seem that if I seek to avoid all of those, I mean, some of those are the kinds of things that lead to making friendships. I mean, everyone would be the same out there. I don't mean to get off on a tangent, but if I carried that to an extreme, I'd have the same relationship with everyone, and I wouldn't have friends. So we make friends on certain bases of affinities, I guess, some of it. That's where my mind was taking me as you went through that, and just maybe just speak to that a moment.
Yeah, I think that's a great point for clarification. So I think when we think of biases and we think of prejudice as well, prejudices and biases can also have a positive connotation in the sense of like it's not always negative. So you don't always have a negative understanding or stereotype. Sometimes stereotypes are positive. I would say when we're thinking about the affinity of it, it's just being intentional with making sure that not everyone in your wheelhouse or in your team has the exact same understanding, comes from the exact same space, has the same viewpoints, because you're not going to have any sort of you're not going to have the same amount of chance for a diverse conversation and multiple perspectives. If it's just like me and my college friends, we're all very, very similar. That's where we have that's who I socialize with. That's who, they're in my wedding. They're in these particular places. When I actually practiced a presentation with two of my girlfriends from college last week, because Byron, my supervisor, typically gives that presentation, and I was the one who had to give it. So I was like, oh, I'm not sure if I'm ready to do this, but I'm going to go ahead and give this presentation. When I gave the presentation to them, that's when we kind of saw each other as professionals and not just as friends. And so I think when we had that opportunity to say, okay, this is what Janelle does for a living, and this is her subject matter expertise, if you will, versus what I do for a living, we're able to see each other in different lights. I think when you have affinity with folks, you have to be able to engage in different environments, so that way you can understand where some of those different perspectives are coming from. Typically with my friends, I'm only in friend settings. I'm not, if they're not within my field, if they're not friends and colleagues within my field, I'm not engaging with them around topics of inequity and bias in the same way as I would with colleagues in this field or on this Zoom call. So that experience is coming from more of a lived experience versus an educating, advocating realm, if that makes sense. So I think the affinity can be positive. It's just when you're building groups and you're in spaces where you have high levels of influence and you're teaching or you're building curriculum or you're mentoring, you have to think about what voices are not in this space and make sure that those voices also have a seat at the table or are being engaged with the material as well. So it's not necessarily bad, but I would say just try and make sure that you're being intentional and saying, okay, who's missing from this conversation, even as friends? Whose perspective isn't at the table?
Janelle, there's a 7 or 8 faculty here, and we're representing biology, chemistry, physics, engineering, so sort of the traditional STEM disciplines. And to put you on the spot a little bit, if you don't mind, what 1 or 2 things do faculty members at Valpo need to know to help overcome some of the barriers that we have to diversity and inclusion, specifically in the STEM disciplines? You hear students' stories in a way that many of us don't. So what would you have to tell us?
I've heard far too often Crystal's story. So Crystal shared that, I was told I shouldn't be here, essentially. And I hear that from a number of students who are switching their majors out of the STEM fields. And that's because either their math isn't up to par and no one's giving them a chance. And they're saying, well, you're not ready. You're not where the rest of everyone else is. And so if you can't do the math, then you're not going to be successful in this field. Like, logically, that makes sense. But to me, that's one of the barriers. What do we do to remove that barrier? So it doesn't mean that you have to spend all of your office hours with this particular student, but what are all of the measures that we can possibly do before we say, maybe you should consider switching your major? Have we talked about the SI sessions? Have we gotten them a tutor? Are there other prereq classes that we can get them in before we say, no, this isn't the right place for you? So I think that that's the biggest piece, is really thinking about why is this particular student in this scenario, and not thinking of them from a collective marginalized group, but this particular individual student. What do you need as a person? And not, I had a Latinx student or I had a Black student before and this is what helped them, but what's this individual need? And what are other ways that we can get them to engage with the material? Sometimes a lot of it has to deal with our learning styles are different, and how we learn and how we interpret information and material just may not be the way that your teaching style accommodates the way I learn. And if you're able to sit down with a student one-on-one, you might have an opportunity to learn more about what best fits their modalities. But I know that you can't do that for every single student, and recognizing that you guys have a big caseload, et cetera. I've also heard those stories from students having negative experiences with their advisors. And so I'm not sure how advising is set up within STEM, but I know that sometimes with our professional advisors, there's that feeling of, all right, it's time to move you forward. You're not doing well, and doing well might be a B-. So doing well for a student, a B- might be, hey, awesome, I passed, I'm good, I'm ready to go, I can engage, I just don't do well with tests. And I hear that a lot, like testing is just really hard, but I can understand and I can communicate the information back to you, and I can build things and we can operate. But when we get to the test, it's very difficult sometimes for people to actually put the information out there. And so I think that's one of the things too, is recognizing our advisors need some training as well. And if you're a faculty advisor, how are you, that level of authority and I don't say control, but maybe power or influence is a better word, that you have over a student's future is really important to recognize. Because even though you might be saying, like, in your head, I don't know if you're going to make it. This is going to be really tough. I've had you in class before. I'm not sure if this is the best route. That student's already doubting that for themselves, especially if they've come to you for help, which is hard for a lot of marginalized communities to do, is ask for help. And so if they're not even willing to come to you and ask for help, then there's a whole nother barrier that we have to address too. So I would say recognize what those barriers are to retention, and also contact the students who have switched their majors and see why they left. And are you seeing an overwhelmingly large number of marginalized students leaving the STEM field? And if so, why?
Thank you.
All right, we've got a message in the chat. Please make sure. Okay, bye. Happy anniversary.
Well, thanks again, Janelle. We really appreciate your time and taking the time to sort through some of the responses that the students wrote, and just facilitating this discussion on Zoom. So
yeah,
thanks again.
Thank you. See you next summer.
Well, hopefully before then. Yeah.
True.
Yeah.
Right.
Hope you have a good summer, and I know there in my department in physics we wanted to wait till this presentation was over, but we would like to invite you to come to a department meeting whenever it's a little more convenient. I don't know if that'll be in the summer or early in the fall, but we have some questions, and we want to get some feedback from you on things, ways that we can improve along the lines of the question that I asked.
Yeah, awesome. I'd love to. I've got my, well, it's over there. I've got my mask, so.
Yeah, I don't know what our meeting structure is going to look like in the fall. We may end up doing it online, but we certainly want to connect and not wait till next summer.
Yeah, great.
Thanks again. Thanks everybody for coming. And I will let you know when the